before the deadly collision between Black Hawk chopper and an American Airlines plane.
Now to that deadly air ambulance crash in Philadelphia.
World leaders have been sending condolences to South Korea after the country's deadliest aviation disaster on home soil.
The new year got off to a terrible start. What caused a passenger jet and a Black Hawk helicopter to collide in midair over Washington, D.C., and what caused an air ambulance to crash just seconds after takeoff? Let's examine the events that led to these tragic. On January the 29th, 2012, PSA Airlines Flight 5342 was on its final approach to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The aircraft had taken off from Wichita earlier that evening, carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. 2 experienced pilots were at the controls. The captain had been with PSA Airlines for nearly 6 years, and the first officer had been with the airline for almost 2 years. The flight had been routine up to this point, and the weather conditions had been favorable. While the pilots were preparing to land, a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter, call sign PAT-25, was on a night training mission a few miles away. The Black Hawk, which had 3 crew members on board, was part of an annual evaluation exercise. The flight focused on training military pilots for low-altitude maneuvers over the Potomac River, a mission requiring precision, coordination, and strict adherence to assigned altitudes. The pilots had been instructed to stay at or below 200 feet while following Route 1 before transitioning to Route 4. This well-known helicopter corridor near Reagan National Airport intersects multiple approach and departure routes, requiring precise coordination with air traffic control. The management of this complex airspace was the responsibility of the air traffic controllers at Reagan National, who were tasked with coordinating both planes and helicopters. However, Reagan National had been dealing with a controller shortage for years. On this particular night, only one controller was responsible for managing both plane and helicopter traffic. Typically, these roles were handled separately during peak hours, but they had been consolidated earlier than usual that night. The New York Times reports on this. Control tower staffing not normal at time of the Washington crash. That's a serious claim. In aviation safety, every detail matters. Yet coverage of this story varies widely, and that's why I use Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. It's an app and website that gathers news worldwide, including local and underground sources, so you can easily compare coverage. Honestly, the more I research with Ground News, the more I really like what they're accomplishing. Take this story, for example. It's been covered by more than 300 sources, but depending on where you look, the headlines and explanations vary widely. Today, a left-leaning outlet reports that air traffic control staffing is in the spotlight in the wake of the crash. Meanwhile, Reason, a right-leaning outlet, argues that understaffing was unlikely a factor in the crash. With Ground News, you get insight into how credible these sources are and who funds them, all factors that can influence the reporting. You can compare all sides of the story to see the full picture or sort by any of these factors to find the type of information you prefer in an instant. Best of all, you're not relying on manipulative algorithms deciding what news you see. The controller on duty that evening cleared Flight 5342 to land on runway 1. However, as the aircraft approached, the controller reassigned it to runway 33. This required the pilots to execute a sidestep maneuver to align with the shorter runway. In doing so, they would descend over the Potomac River and cross the path of the Black Hawk.
Tower 5342 on that runway, visual runway 1. 5342, Washington Tower 1 star 320.7, 25. Take runway 33. Yeah, we can do 33 for 5342. 5342, at the Wilson 3, thanks for runway 33, runway 33, way.
Meanwhile, the Black Hawk continued its training flight following the Potomac River as it approached the airport. The air traffic controller asked the crew if they had the CRJ in sight. The crew confirmed visual contact and requested visual separation, meaning they would ensure safe spacing. The controller approved. In the meantime, the pilots of Flight 5342 had begun their landing sequence, making a slight right turn before the final left turn to align with runway 33. At this point, a series of events may have led to the plane's misidentification. The NTSB is still investigating the matter, but several factors could have contributed to the confusion. Both helicopter pilots likely wore night vision goggles designed to enhance low-light visibility. However, these goggles restricted peripheral vision and made depth perception more complex, potentially making it harder to judge distances accurately. The challenge of spotting the plane was further compounded by the city lights behind the approach path of runway 33, which blended in with the incoming aircraft. Additionally, while the landing lights were on, they were forward-facing, making them less visible from the side, where the Black Hawk was flying. As the plane and the Black Hawk were closing in on each other, the conflict alert warning was activated in the tower. The controller responded and asked the helicopter crew to confirm whether they had a visual of the approaching CRJ. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Flight 5342 continued its descent toward runway 33, executing a steep left turn required for landing. At the same time, the Black Hawk had strayed nearly half a mile off its planned route and was flying around 325 feet, exceeding the maximum assigned altitude for Route 4. According to the NTSB, the cockpit crew received a traffic advisory warning about the impending collision. Typically, below 500 feet, many TCAS systems do not issue oral traffic warnings. But in this case, one was triggered. Traffic. Traffic. However, the crew had only 15 to 18 seconds to react. With the Black Hawk now directly in its flight path, Flight 5342 continued its descent. Seconds later, at 8:48, the two collided. The collision shattered the Black Hawk mid-air, sending flaming debris into the Potomac River. The jet suffered severe damage, lost control, and plunged into the river just half a mile from the runway threshold. Minutes after the incident was reported, emergency responders from Washington, D.C., Arlington County, Maryland State Police, and the U.S. Coast Guard arrived at the crash site. Fireboats, helicopters, and dive teams were involved in a search and rescue operation. However, the conditions were harsh. The water temperature was near freezing, and strong currents made recovery efforts more challenging. All 67 lives were lost in the crash. The collision was the deadliest U.S. aviation disaster in 16 years. Just 2 days after the Washington crash, another tragedy struck. A Learjet went down seconds after takeoff, turning an air ambulance mission into a fatal accident. On the 31st of January, a Learjet 55 was preparing for a critical mission, operating as MedJet's Flight 056. The aircraft was going to take a child and her mother from Northeast Philadelphia Airport to Tijuana, Mexico. It would stop at Springfield Airport in Missouri for refueling. That evening, the sky was overcast with fog, light rain, and wind gusts reaching 30 miles per hour. Despite these conditions, visibility remained at 6 miles, well within operational limits. As the crew completed their final checks and received clearance from air traffic control, Flight 056 began taxiing to runway 24. 6 people were on board: a young patient, her mother, 2 pilots, a doctor, and a flight paramedic. The aircraft was operated by Jet Rescue Air Ambulance, which specializes in transporting patients abroad for medical reasons. Air ambulances are essential because they can quickly get people to the hospital when ground ambulances can't. They help patients survive and recover, especially in places without good hospitals. At 6:06 p.m., the aircraft lined up on runway 24 and was cleared for takeoff.
Medevac, mid-service 056, on departure, turn right heading 290, runway 24, clear for takeoff, wind 25010.
Regrettably, this was the aircraft's final transmission. While flying over residential and commercial areas, its nose pitched down, leading to a rapid loss of altitude. The pilots needed to take immediate corrective action to regain control, but unfortunately, they were unable to do so. The Learjet crashed into a busy commercial area near Roosevelt Mall, just 3 miles from the airport. Upon impact, the aircraft exploded, taking the lives of all 6 people on board. On the ground, 1 person passed away and at least 19 others were injured, some of whom suffered burns from the fires that broke out. Subsequent data indicated that the aircraft had reached an altitude of 1,650 feet. However, just 40 seconds after takeoff, it began to descend at an alarming rate, plummeting over 11,000 feet per minute before it hit the ground. The crash site revealed significant damage to several businesses and homes, with the wreckage scattered across the area. Security cameras and dash cams captured the aircraft's descent before it burst into flames upon impact. This incident marked the second fatal accident involving jet rescue since a 2023 crash at Cuenca Airport in Mexico that claimed the lives of 4 people. On February 2nd, the NTSB successfully recovered the cockpit voice recorder and the enhanced ground proximity warning system, which could contain flight data. Both engines were also retrieved. These components were then sent to the vehicle recorder's laboratory for further evaluation. January was a tragic month for aviation, and the month before was no different. On December 29th, a Boeing 737 crashed at Muan International Airport, becoming South Korea's deadliest aviation disaster in decades. The flight was uneventful until the final approach. Just before landing, Jeju Air Traffic Control warned about the possibility of a bird strike. The aircraft then deviated several times from the approach path, possibly to avoid birds, but it always returned to the correct path. The airspeed remained stable, and the rate of descent was normal. Muan International Airport has the highest rate of bird strikes among the 14 regional airports in South Korea, with 10 incidents in the last 5 years. The aircraft was approaching the airport around 9 a.m., a time when birds are typically most active. 2 minutes after receiving the warning, the crew declared a mayday due to a bird strike. They then initiated a go-around. The exact reason for this decision remains unclear to this day. Following standard procedure, the crew retracted the flaps and landing gear and requested to land in the opposite direction. This likely indicated the situation's urgency, suggesting they wanted to land as quickly as possible. They made a 180-degree turn and attempted to land on runway 1N, without flaps and with the landing gear retracted. The reason the landing gear, flaps, and their respective backup systems failed to function, or were not deployed, remains unknown and must be determined through further investigation. Without the flaps deployed, the aircraft's landing speed was significantly higher than usual. Moreover, it touched down nearly halfway down the runway, leaving little space to decelerate. The nose was kept up during landing, which resulted in the aircraft maintaining a high speed due to less friction, making it hard to slow down. The right engine thrust reverser appeared to be used, but the plane could still not stop in time. The aircraft eventually overran the runway and crashed into a berm, encasing a concrete structure that supported an antenna array for the instrument landing system. The collision killed all 175 passengers and 4 of the 6 crew members. The surviving 2 cabin crew were seated in the rear of the plane, which detached from the fuselage, and were rescued with injuries. They were taken to the hospital but were later discharged. Feathers and bird blood stains were found on each engine. The samples were sent to specialized organizations for DNA analysis, which identified them as belonging to Baikal teals, a small duck native to East Asia. A man walks home after a long day at work. Above him, the distant roar of an aircraft grows louder. It sounds different, heavier, closer than usual. He slows down and looks up. A Boeing 747, clearly in serious danger.